What if I told you that the greatest legend in football history was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible? What if I told you that on June 10th, 2026, something happened that would shake the entire football world to its core? What if I told you that a match nobody expected to matter would become the most important 75 seconds of an entire nation's World Cup campaign? You need to watch this. Cristiano Ronaldo was 41 years old. 41 years old. Let that sink in for a second. At an age when most athletes are sitting in broadcast booths, when most legends are writing memoirs, when most superstars are collecting appearance fees at celebrity golf tournaments, Cristiano Ronaldo was still trying to be the best player on the pitch, still demanding the ball in critical moments, still believing that he could will a nation to World Cup glory. But belief, as it turns out, isn't always enough. And on this particular evening, in a small Portuguese town called Leiria, the world was about to discover just how fragile that belief had become. Portugal's coach Roberto Martinez stood on the sideline, and he was sweating. Not because it was hot, not because of the pressure of the upcoming World Cup. No, he was sweating because he was staring directly at a problem he couldn't ignore anymore. A problem that had been growing for months, a problem that had a name, and that name was Ronaldo. Because as Portugal's star striker missed his first chance of the match, as the ball sailed harmlessly wide of the post, Martinez knew something that the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. He knew that Portugal's entire World Cup campaign might come down to a single decision, the decision to either trust the legend or to trust the future. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because this story doesn't start with Ronaldo's failure. It starts with his greatness. It starts with the reason anyone expected him to be here in the first place. This is the story of the match that changed everything. June 10th, 2026. It's 4 days before the FIFA World Cup officially begins. 4 days. That's all the time Portugal had left to get their final preparations right. That's all the time they had to fix their problems, to build confidence, to answer the question that every World Cup contender has to answer. Are we actually ready for this? And the test they chose wasn't some meaningless exhibition match against a lower-ranked nation. No. They chose Nigeria, a team that hadn't made the World Cup, a team that had rebuild written all over them, a team that had absolutely nothing to lose and everything to prove. What Portugal didn't expect was for that team to actually show up ready to fight. The Estadio Doctor, Magalhães Pessoa in Leiria was filling up, Portuguese fans everywhere. The noise was building. This was supposed to be a celebration. This was supposed to be the victory lap before the big tournament. This was supposed to be the moment where Ronaldo, one final time, reminded the world why he'd spent his entire life dominating football. But Nigeria had different ideas. When the whistle blew, Portugal moved the ball like they'd practiced this exact routine 1,000 times, which they had. Vitinha controlled the tempo from midfield with the kind of intelligence that only comes from playing at the absolute highest level week after week. João Neves, the 18-year-old generational talent, moved into spaces that shouldn't have existed. Bruno Fernandes, one of the most creative midfielders in world football, started pulling strings like a puppet master. And above them all, Cristiano Ronaldo moved with purpose, with hunger, with the kind of desperation that comes when you know your time is running out. 20 minutes into the match, Portugal had barely let Nigeria touch the ball. This was supposed to be a coronation. This was supposed to be the moment where Portugal showed the world that they were ready. This was supposed to be easy. And then, at the 23-minute mark, it was. Pedro Neto received a cutback from Diogo Dalot. The timing was perfect. The angle was perfect. The execution was perfect. Neto's left foot connected with the ball like he was trying to prove something, and the ball flew past the goalkeeper and into the bottom corner, 1-0, Portugal. The crowd erupted. This was how it was supposed to go. But something happened in that moment that nobody expected. When Nigeria saw Portugal celebrate, when they heard the crowd roar, something shifted in their mentality. See, Nigeria knew they weren't the favorite. Nigeria knew they weren't supposed to win this match. Nigeria wasn't even in the World Cup. But they also knew something else. They knew that a goal up wasn't the same as a victory. And they knew that Portugal's defense, as good as it was, could be vulnerable if they could just find the right moment. 14 minutes later, they found it. Acor Adams took the ball in midfield. Now at this point, nobody expected anything special from Acor Adams. He wasn't on anyone's radar as a world-class forward. He wasn't the kind of player that scouts were writing reports about. He was just a guy trying to prove he belonged at this level. And that's exactly why what happened next was so devastating, because Adams looked up, saw the space ahead of him, and instead of playing it safe, instead of passing to a teammate, instead of doing the conservative thing, he just drove forward. He didn't run around Portugal's defense. He drove straight through it. He physically bulldozed his way through 3 Portuguese defenders like they weren't even there. Like they were pylons in a training ground exercise. And the Portuguese defenders, they tried to stop him. They tried to block him. They tried to use their experience to shut him down. But Adams was too powerful, too committed, too desperate. He was playing for his country's honor. He was playing for the chance to prove that Nigeria belonged on this stage. And when he reached the penalty area, when the moment of truth arrived, he didn't hesitate. He didn't get nervous. He didn't think about what could go wrong. He just finished. A left-footed shot that went right through the goalkeeper's legs and into the bottom corner. 1-1. And just like that, everything changed. The entire atmosphere in the stadium shifted. The Portuguese fans who had been celebrating their nation's dominance suddenly went quiet. The Nigerian players who had been getting outplayed suddenly had hope. The momentum that had been entirely Portugal's suddenly belonged to nobody. And most importantly, Cristiano Ronaldo suddenly realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The first half ended in that state, 1 apiece. And as the players walked toward the tunnel, you could see it on every face. This was not the warm-up match anyone had planned. This was a real fight. This was a genuine test. And Portugal, the nation that was supposed to be World Cup contenders, was being forced to prove it. What happened at halftime would define the entire second half of this match. Roberto Martinez, the Portugal coach, looked at his team. He looked at the scoreline, he looked at the performance, and he made a decision that shocked everyone. He decided to change almost his entire starting lineup. 9 outfield players. Gone. Replaced. It wasn't a tactical tweak. It wasn't a couple of substitutions to manage fatigue. It was a complete overhaul. It was a manager saying, without saying a word, that something fundamental needed to change. Out came Tomás Araujo. Out came João Cancelo. Out came Nuno Mendes. In came fresh legs. In came new energy. In came players who hadn't played the first half and were desperate to prove themselves in the second. Ruben Neves took control of the midfield with the kind of experience that only comes from playing hundreds of matches at the highest level. Bernardo Silva's intelligence flooded into the attacking positions. João Felix, one of the most creative players in world football, took the right flank. And Francisco Conceição, a player who would become the unlikely hero of this entire narrative, positioned himself on the right wing with something to prove. But Ronaldo stayed. The legend remained on the pitch. And as the second half began, something extraordinary happened. Portugal suddenly looked like a completely different team. The fresh legs made the difference. The new tactics worked. They pressed higher up the pitch. They moved the ball with more intent. They created chances, multiple chances, clear-cut, cannot-miss opportunities, and Ronaldo had them, all of them. At 55 minutes, Ronaldo had a chance, a dead duck, the kind of chance you see strikers miss maybe once every 50 matches, right in front of goal. The goalkeeper out of position, the whole world holding its breath, waiting for the legend to do what legends do. And Ronaldo missed, wide, completely wide. The shot that should have made it 2-1 for Portugal sailed past the post like he'd never kicked a football in his life. And you could feel it in that moment. You could feel something shifting, because Ronaldo didn't just miss a chance. Ronaldo had shown the world that the reflexes, that the instinct, that the predatory finishing that had made him the greatest goal scorer of his generation was slipping away, slipping into the past, getting lost somewhere in the 41-year journey through his career. 2 minutes later, another chance, another miss, wide again. And then, at 65 minutes, Martinez made his move. He brought Gonçalo Ramos on, he brought Ronaldo off, and in that moment, something became clear. The coach was saying, "You're done. Your time is up. The future is now." But Portugal still needed to win this match. Portugal still needed to prove that they were ready. And Portugal still didn't have a lead. 1-1. And the clock was ticking. What happened next was the turning point. The moment that would define not just this match, but potentially Portugal's entire World Cup campaign. Because at the 74th minute, with the match hanging in the balance, with both teams exhausted, with the intensity at a level that neither side could maintain much longer, a play developed on the right wing. João Cancelo had the ball. The Portuguese fullback, a player who had reinvented his career multiple times, who had played for some of the biggest clubs in world football, who had won everything there was to win at club level, saw a moment. A moment where Nigeria's defense was just slightly out of position, just a fraction off balance. just enough space for something magical to happen. Cancelo looked to his right. He saw Francisco Conceição, a player who had been relatively quiet all match, a player who hadn't had much impact, a player who was running out of time to make a difference. And Cancelo made the decision. He made the pass. One-touch pass directly into Conceição's feet. Perfect weight, perfect timing, perfect placement. Conceição took one touch. One. That's all he needed. One touch to shift the ball onto his left foot. One touch to create the angle. One touch to set himself up for what was about to happen. And then, from the edge of the penalty area, Conceição struck the ball, not with panic, not with desperation, with absolute precision, with the kind of geometry that only comes when a player completely believes in what they're about to do. The ball flew through the air. The Nigerian goalkeeper, Maduka Okoye, watched it come toward him. His body told him to move. His instincts told him to react. But his brain was processing information just a fraction too slowly. Because by the time his body started to move, the ball was already past him, already in the back of the net, already the most important goal of this entire match. 2-1. Portugal. Finally, Portugal had the lead they needed. And in that moment, everything changed again. But this time, it changed in Portugal's favor. Because when you're clinging to a one-goal lead late in a World Cup warm-up match against an opponent who has nothing to lose, you can suddenly afford to be a little bit smarter, a little bit more conservative, a little bit more focused on protecting what you have rather than chasing what you might get. Nigeria pushed forward in the final minutes. They had to. They had nothing to lose. They made changes. They brought fresh attacking players onto the pitch. They threw numbers forward. They created chances. They came so close to finding an equalizer that you could practically taste it. Maduka Okoye, the Nigerian goalkeeper, made several brilliant saves. Saves that would normally be celebrated as the difference between victory and defeat. But this time, they were just delaying the inevitable. Because when the final whistle came, when the referee blew the last note of the match, Portugal had their victory. 2-1. They had survived. They had gotten the result. And they were heading into the World Cup with a win under their belts, which was exactly what they'd wanted. But here's the thing that nobody was talking about. Here's the thing that Roberto Martinez knew. Here's the thing that would become the defining theme of Portugal's entire World Cup campaign. Portugal hadn't won because of Ronaldo. They'd won in spite of Ronaldo. They'd won because Francisco Conceição had found a moment of brilliance when it mattered most. They'd won because João Felix, a younger, hungrier version of the attacking creativity that Ronaldo represented, had been on the pitch to make the difference. They'd won because the midfield, the backbone of this entire team, had stepped up when the attacking players failed to deliver. And most painfully, they'd won because Ronaldo, the legend, the icon, the greatest footballer of his generation, had finally revealed the truth that everyone had been avoiding. He wasn't the difference maker anymore. The reflexes were gone. The finishing was gone. The instinct, the hunger, the ability to single-handedly drag a team to victory was gone. And Portugal was going to have to win the World Cup without him as their focal point. Ronaldo had played 65 minutes. He'd had 3 clear chances. He'd missed all 3. He'd created nothing. He'd added nothing beyond his presence. And when he came off the pitch, when he took his place on the bench, you could see it on his face. He knew. The legend knew that his time had passed. But Nigeria, despite the loss, had proven something that nobody expected. They'd proven that they could compete with one of the favorites. They'd proven that they had players capable of playing at the highest level. And they'd proven that sometimes the most important matches aren't the ones you win. They're the ones you nearly win. They're the ones where you show the world that you're not as far away as everyone thinks you are. As Portugal celebrated their victory, the celebrations were muted. Not because they were unhappy about winning, but because they knew what they'd seen. They knew that they were a team in transition. They knew that they couldn't rely on their aging superstar anymore. They knew that they were going to have to find a new identity, a new way of winning, a new version of themselves that didn't depend on one man carrying the entire burden. And as they packed their bags and prepared for their journey to the World Cup, as they left Liria behind and headed toward the tournament proper, they carried with them a lesson that would define everything that came next. Sometimes, the most important warm-up match isn't the one where everything goes perfectly. It's the one where you're forced to see the truth. And Portugal had seen their truth on this night. They had seen that the future was going to belong to their young players. That players like Francisco Conceição, like João Felix, like the entire new generation of Portuguese football, were going to have to carry the torch. That the legacy of Cristiano Ronaldo, while still immense and still important, was no longer going to define their destiny. 2-1. That's what the scoreboard said. But the real score, the score that mattered, was something else entirely. It was the score of a nation learning how to become something new. It was the score of a legend finally accepting that his time had passed. It was the score of a future being born right before our eyes. And as we head into the World Cup, as we prepare for 2 months of absolute football madness, as we get ready for the greatest tournament in the world, one thing is certain: Portugal is ready. But they're ready in a completely different way than anyone expected. They're ready because they know they can't rely on individual brilliance anymore. They're ready because they've learned that hunger and youth and intelligence and coordination matter just as much as experience and reputation. They're ready because on the night of June 10th, 2026, in a small Portuguese town called Leiria, they were forced to grow up. They were forced to evolve. And they emerged from that night different, better, stronger. This is what happens when legends finally accept their mortality. This is what happens when nations are forced to reinvent themselves. This is what happens when the future crashes into the past and wins. And if you think you're ready for what comes next, you're probably underestimating just how wild this World Cup is going to be. Because if Portugal can look this good while saying goodbye to their greatest ever player, imagine what they can do when they finally embrace.